So Plato's Republic culminates in Book 7, as I said last time, and then he shows the forces that will bring about the degeneration of the ideal state, the ideal polis, the republic. So I want to give my last lecture on Plato for you on Book 6 and Book 7. Now, in Book 6, a lot has transpired between Book 1 and Book 6. Socrates has been developing this ideal state and the structure of the state. And now what's so important is the education of the leaders, the rulers. Remember, there are two types of rulers. There are the leaders, and then the auxiliary rulers. The auxiliary rulers are the part that corresponds to the spirited part of our soul. And that's the military and the police. And then corresponding to the appetite part of our soul are the professions and the artisans and the business class, the class of commerce. Corresponding to the intellectual part of our soul are the rulers. Now, what's important and what's all important in Plato's Republic and any republic is the education of the rulers, of the leaders. Okay? So what Plato does in the Republic, in Book 6 and throughout Book 7, they're talking about the education of the rulers. Now, Socrates has already established the fact, and you probably, if you've been reading the excerpts from Books 2, 3, 4, 5, and all the way to 6, you realize that Socrates had already established the fact that the wisest people need to be ruling. The people who have the greatest wisdom, and that is practical wisdom as well as speculative wisdom, and the people who are most excellent in their character, who possess the moral virtues like courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. So the ones that will be most concerned about the well-being of the whole, which is justice, to bring about the well-being of the commonwealth. So what's so important for Plato, and what's just important for any republic, are the leaders. And how does a leader become a leader? Well, part of it is just a gift. One is born a leader. But in addition to that gift, there's ability. And abilities can be educated. So what's all important is the education of the leaders. Now, Socrates has already had everyone present accept the fact that the wisest people need to be rulers. So he believes that the lovers of wisdom are the wisest people, people like Socrates. So there should be philosopher rulers. Actually, let me just give a little aside here to show the preeminence of the political for Plato. First of all, the Republic is one of the largest books that he wrote. But not only that, 3 times in real life, the historical person, Plato, went to a place called Syracuse, Saracusa, which has the same name today. And it's in southern Italy now, in Sicily, which in ancient times was part of Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. It belonged to the Greek world. It wasn't a nation. Greece wasn't a nation. There were no nations yet. The nation state came later on. But the Greek world was a group of city-states, each with their own constitution, and they were the polis. So in Syracuse, there was a person who was inclined toward Plato's philosophy. His name was Dion. And there was a ruler there. His name was Dionysius II. And Plato thought that perhaps Dion could be one of these philosopher rulers. that he was talking about in the Republic. And 3 times he went to Syracuse to actually put this Republic into practice. So this tells me that he was serious about the Republic, and he was also serious about the idea of the philosopher rulers. And 3 times it failed, and the last time was a fiasco. Um, Dion was like assassinated by this tyrant who was ruling in Syracuse, and Plato and his group were incarcerated, and his friends had to come from Athens and they sprang him out of jail. So this tells me, though, that he was serious about his republic, and because he actually went 3 times. And also, he was serious about the idea of the philosopher rulers. I don't think Plato was naive and idealistic in the normal sense of the word, to think that it's going to be easy to have philosophers be rulers, to have philosophy rule, because philosophers by nature don't really want to rule things, and the people don't want philosophy to rule. So it's not going to be an easy task. But I do think he believed that, and he was sincere about that there will be justice in the state. He even says this directly in the 7th letter, that only when philosophers become rulers. And it makes sense that the wisest people should rule, the ones with the greatest speculative and practical wisdom, and the ones that you can trust morally and ethically to work for the common good and not for his or her own self. So the opposite of the philosopher would be the tyrant. And Plato, that's why I wanted to focus on Thrasymachus in book 1 and other dialogues. There are other tyrants that Socrates meets where words and arguments, it doesn't really matter. They're motivated by other things: power, profit. Okay, so this idea of the philosopher rulers. And so now what they're talking about in book 6, Socrates is talking with Glaucon, who's Plato's brother, but Plato puts him in the dialogue. Glaucon actually became a politician, whereas Plato himself, we know, became this great philosopher. But politics was always at the forefront of his thought. But he wanted radical political restoration. He wanted a new structure of the state. He thought there needs to be republics, but there needs to be aristocratic republics. So this is, I told you, the beginnings of this long history, this great and rich history, which I'm very concerned about, Republican political theory, Plato's Republic. So they're talking about the education of the philosopher rulers, the education of the rulers. That's really important. Well, Plato presents it in 2 ways. At first, in book 6, he has Socrates present the famous divided line. Okay, so I'll go over the divided line with you now. And then he wants us to take this divided line and use it as a master key to interpret the most famous passage in all philosophy, called the Allegory of the Cave. Some of you have had me in other classes. You probably heard my lecture or parts of my lecture on the Allegory of the Cave. I'll try to be succinct and to the point, but I've taught it for years. I never tire of it for some reason, and I definitely get bored easily with things. For some reason, I never get bored with this. And it's one of the most powerful passages in all philosophy. It's in every anthology. It's even people who have just a cursory knowledge of philosophy have heard of the famous Allegory of the Cave. But what I've discovered is what Plato wants us to do is to take the divided line and use it to a certain degree, use it as an interpretive key, as a master key to interpret the Allegory of the Cave. And I say that with textual evidence because somewhere in the text, I could find it if I had the text with me now, Socrates actually says that. And Plato has Socrates say, when he's talking about the Allegory of the Cave, if you just remember what we were just talking about, and he was referring to the divided line, and you can use it now to interpret the Allegory of the Cave. The other reason I think that he wants us to use the divided line as an interpretive key for the Allegory of the Cave is it fits perfectly. I mean, there are 4 sections of the line, and there are 4 levels of the cave. Everything fits together like a puzzle. And so it wouldn't fit so perfectly if that's not what he had in mind. But he actually comes right out and says it. Well, Plato doesn't say it. He has Socrates say it. But Plato wrote the dialogue and he has Socrates say that. Say what? Say that. Remember what we were just talking about. He's referring back to the divided line. But there's more to the allegory of the cave than the divided line. The divided line is the education of the philosopher rulers expressed purely abstractly. Remember we made that distinction when I was talking about the rise of pre-Socratic philosophy, how before that everything was thought in terms of imagery. And then with the rise of the pre-Socratics, images were still there, but mostly they were working for the sake of the concept, abstract concepts. Well, Plato is at home in both, the image and the concept. He's a poet, philosopher. So what he does, he can present the same idea in abstract concepts and then present it again in an allegorical form using imagery. And in that way, he could conquer the whole person who's reading. Because a person is not just intellect. We have passions, we have perception, and we can see with our inner senses these images. And images have passion connected to them. Concepts are lifeless and bloodless, you know. So he wants to convince. Think about the word convince. Con means with, vincere, it's my last name, Vincenzo, means to conquer. In order to convince someone, you have to conquer the whole person. Well, the whole person is not just an intellect. We have passion, we have an appetites, and we have an inner sensibility where we can see these images. So Plato gives both. The divided line is purely abstract. All right, so the line is like this. And imagine, it's easy to work with on the blackboard or something, but imagine this line. And then on the top of the line, not touching the line, but above the line, put a dot. So you can just draw a line, and above the line, draw it vertically. Then above the line, make a dot. Okay. And then there's two sides of this line. On one side of the line are powers of the soul. And then on the other side of that line, moving horizontally on this side of the line, are levels of reality. Okay, so there's a correspondence between a power of the soul and levels of reality. Power of the soul is disclosing what? A level of reality. Now the whole idea is to move up the line. So Socrates is talking with Glaucon, and this is Plato's way of expressing this education of the philosopher king. Before we go on though, I need to tell you the word paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A. It was probably pronounced paideia. The D had a TH sound in ancient times. Paideia, P-A-I-D-E-I-A. That's the ancient Greek word for education. But Plato is going to develop his own philosophy of education here. And it's going to be the education of the philosopher rulers. But really what he's talking about is, what is education? For anyone who wants to be educated. But the best education has to be for the rulers. So everything hinges on the education of the rulers. In order to be a good ruler, you have to be educated properly. So now the divided line is going to speak about 4 different powers of the soul. And these 4 different powers of the soul are a continuum. And they reveal greater and greater levels of reality and truth as you move up. Now the lowest power of the soul he calls imagining, but it's not imagination. What he means by that is when you just listen to hearsay, you hear what somebody else said instead of listening. You know, that's a big deal today. Like there are allocations made between the Republicans and Democrats that, you know, somebody said something. So, okay, if it follows a pattern, you know, you can use your common sense too. But at the same time, there's a difference between hearsay and direct evidence. That's a big point in law too. There's circumstantial evidence, there's hearsay, and then there's concrete evidence like DNA and so on. Okay, so what he means by that is when you're listening to somebody else and you you haven't gone to the source yourself. That's called hearsay. On the material plane, it would be like a copy of the material world, like representational art. Like if I make a copy of a tree, so the tree is the reality, and then the copy of the tree would be the object that's revealed by imagining. So on the bottom level of the line is imagining, and what imagining reveals is a copy of the sensuous particular, the sensible particular. What do I mean by sensible particular? It's sensible because you can see it and touch it, taste it, smell it, all five senses. When I say see, I mean all five senses. So you can see it. I can see the tree. I can go and touch it if I wanted to, and taste it if I smell it, whatever. But it's this tree, this particular tree. It's not the idea of a tree or so on. Okay. So if I make a copy of that tree, then that's a copy of the tree. And that's revealed by imagining. Oh, I forgot to tell you, when you take the line, remember I told you draw this horizontal, vertical line, on top make a dot, but the dot is not touching the line, that's important. And come about 2/3 of the way down and then divide it horizontally. Then take each of those two segments. So you got this vertical line, you come down 2/3 and you draw a horizontal line. And then take each of those two spaces and come down 2/3 and draw a line. And then the bottom two, draw another line. So you have 4 spaces. The bottom space is smaller than the next space, it's a little bit bigger. Next space is a little bit bigger, and the top space is the largest. The reason they get bigger as you go up. So if you draw a line and you go 2/3 of the way down and divide it, that's the word divided line, right? You come 2/3 of the way down, divide it. Then you take each of those two sections, come 2/3 of the way down, divide it. Take this section, go 2/3, divide it. Then you have 4 sections, and you have 2 sides of each section. So you have imagining, which reveals the copy of the sensible particular. But Plato means that, there are certain times where you, like I told you, in order to understand Plato or any philosopher, what Plato especially, you take other dialogues and you use those to shine light on the one that you're working on. So that's called textual evidence. You look for patterns. So there are places where you need to loosen up, especially when you're dealing with metaphor. It's not literally true. You're just trying to get the idea. And there are other times where you have to be very rigorous and tighten up. And that comes through practice, where you need to tighten up, where you need to loosen up. And so, but the divided line has these 4 levels. The bottom level is the smallest. And the reason, as you move up, the spaces get bigger. The bigger the space, the more real the reality is for Plato. Okay, so copy of the sensible particular is the lowest level of reality, and that's revealed through imagining. But if you loosen up a little bit, what he's talking about is hearsay and not going to the source, just passing the word along. Now, as you move up to the next level, there's 2 more sections now. You have sense perception. And what that reveals is the sensible particular. So if I look at a tree, my eyes are my senses, and then I see the tree. So my vision reveals the tree. If I touch the tree, then my sense of touch reveals the body of the tree, the materiality of the tree, earth to earth. Remember Empedocles says we can understand earth because we're made of earth. We understand fire because we're made of fire. So, and I've always loved that. So at the second level of the divided line, now Plato will use different words, but I've studied Plato long enough to know where I can loosen up. And he uses the word pistis, which means trust. But what he means is sense perception. Because I know Plato enough to know that when we see something and touch it and taste it with our 5 senses, we trust that what we see is the reality. but it's not knowledge. So that's sense perception. And what sense perception reveals is the sensible particular, not the idea of a tree, not a copy of the tree, this tree, or this cloud, or this whatever it is. Okay? So here, this is a little elephant with the trunk up. My grandma loved to say, when an elephant has its trunk up, it's good luck. Well, it probably is, because they're feeling good if they're making that, right? Okay, so this is a copy of the elephant. Okay, if I'm in Africa, and I want to do that someday before I die, I want to see these animals before they all become extinct. If I see an elephant, then this is a copy of the elephant. Okay. So now we're on the second level of the divided line. This is the elephant that I see in Africa or wherever. I did see them in India. They're different in India. They walk right down the street in India. So you're driving down the street and there's an elephant there. Yeah. So that's a sensible particular, what I see. Okay. Now, those are the two bottom levels. On the side of the reality, those two together, Plato calls doxa. Doxa in Greek means opinion. Okay, so the bottom two levels are only opinion. Okay, so if I listen to hearsay, or if I look at a copy of a thing, that's opinion. Okay, and Plato will make a distinction. In other dialogues, he goes into depth with this. There's a difference between opinion, doxa, and knowledge, which is episteme in Greek. Now, when you move to the third level, which is a little bit bigger, now you're moving out of the realm of the visible, out of the realm of opinion, and into the intelligible region. Okay, this is important because it illustrates Plato's idealism. Plato's the father of this great tradition called idealism, and there are other great idealists. In fact, Western philosophy reaches its epitome in German idealism with Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel. That comes in modern times. And they're all idealists, but they're different from Plato, but they agree in that the idea is this ultimate reality that shapes reality. But that's another course in modern philosophy. So there are other idealists who are great, like Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. But Plato's the father of this tradition of idealism. So when we move to the third level of the divided line, the Greek word that he uses is dianoia. It's D-I-A, which means through in Greek. And then noia means mind. That was Aristotle later, when we study Aristotle, his nickname at the Academy of Plato, when he studied with Plato for 20 years, was nous, which is connected with noia, which means mind. It means mind. That was his nickname. He was the mind. So through mind, now we can perceive with our mind's eye. We can place before our mind's eye, like that's where the word theory comes from, and theater. With a theater, this actors get on the stage and they stand before your eyes. With theoretical knowledge, ideas come before your mind's eye. Okay, your mind has an eye, but they're not eyes, but they reveal. And they reveal what? The form of the thing. They reveal ideas. Eidos in Greek means the look of something. The word that most scholars use is forms. I like ideas, and I use a little I, a lowercase I, for the third level. So dianoia, which you can translate as mind, it means through mind, you can reveal ideas. But these ideas have a little I, a little lowercase I. What that means is like the idea of elephant. Okay, here's a copy of an elephant. Then I'm in Africa or in India somewhere, and there's an elephant on the street or wherever. Now I'm on the second level of the divided line. And then if I'm reading in a zoology book about elephants, and the author is trying to make a claim about all elephants, then he's trying to articulate the idea of elephant. Okay. What Plato uses here is mathematical objects because it's clear, but it can be true about anything. So if you have a copy of a circle, that would be the lowest level of reality. If there's an actual circle, like this little thing here, excuse me, this is circular. Okay, so if I have a copy of a circle, that's one thing. And here's something that's actually circular. But then if I go to geometry class and I'm learning about circular things, and the teacher says a circle is that the perimeters of which are equally distant from the center. That's an idea. That's not something material. Now, why did Plato place the idea above the sensible particular? Why is the idea of a circle more real than this thing, which is circular? Well, now you might want to think about Parmenides. This is where Parmenides influenced Plato. The idea is unchanging. It's perfect. All the things that Parmenides said about reality, about being itself, those, remember I even said that in one of my lectures, Plato takes that verbatim almost. It's almost like he just takes it. But he doesn't, it's true not only about being with a capital B, that's what Parmenides was saying. It's true about these beings, all beings. Whatever is real is unchanging. So the idea of circularity is unchanging. Not only that, it's perfect. Nothing in the real world is equally distant from the center. As soon as I draw a circle, it's imperfect. If I make two circles on the blackboard, one will be closer to the idea of circularity than the other. So the circle that I draw on the blackboard is a copy of the idea of circularity. Now here's the rub. With Plato, the idea of circularity is more real. Remember, it's higher in the divided line, and the space is bigger. It's more real than any physical thing that's circular. Okay? Anything that's circular is circular because it participates in the idea of circularity. And the greater it participates in that idea of circularity, the more circular it is. But it's never going to be perfect because every circle is not, in the material world, it's not perfectly circular. The only perfect circle is the idea of circularity. And it's not just true about circles, it's true about everything for Plato. So the idea of elephant is more real than any elephant. And elephants are elephants because they take on that form of elephant because of the idea of elephant. So it's usually, a materialist is just the opposite. They will say that we have this concept of circularity in our mind because we've experienced things that are circular, and then we extract what's common among all those experiences, and then we have this concept of circularity, but that's not really what's real. It's only in our mind. What's real are these circles in the world that are material. Plato's inverting that because he's an idealist. So now it's not just about circles, like you have to generalize to everything. Now, this is the realm of knowledge. Now we move into the realm of knowledge. We move out of the realm of opinion and into the realm of knowledge, from doxa to episteme, from opinion to knowledge. And from the visible world, which is the bottom two levels of the divided line, we move into the intelligible region because these circles can be known only with our mind, through mind. They have to come before our mind's eye. Not just circles, everything, like tree, dog, everything. Now, what I have learned from this divided line is something that Plato says, or has Socrates say to Glaucon. And Glaucon is asking questions, and then Socrates is clarifying, and so you learn when you engage yourself in the dialogue. And Socrates clarifies. He says, this is the realm of knowledge. So when you go to when you study any discipline, like biology or anthropology or history or any discipline, zoology, you're studying a particular realm of beings. Like biology studies living beings, anthropology studies human beings, psychology studies psychic beings, the parts of the mind, and history, all the different disciplines. Now, zoology, animal life, right? The study of animal life. Zoine means animals, life, animal life. So, but in biology class, you never ask what is life. In anthropology, you don't ask what does it mean to be human. In history, you never ask what is history. In zoology, you don't ask what is an animal. And that's how it should be, because if you did that, you'd be moving out of biology, anthropology, history, zoology. You'd be moving into the philosophy of life, philosophical anthropology, and you'd be asking philosophical questions. Now you're out of science and you're moving into philosophy. So what Plato is saying here is that in the sciences, in the arts, what you're doing is assuming a starting point, and you're not questioning that starting point. Like in biology, you assume that there's life, but you don't ask what is life. In zoology, you assume there's animal life, but you don't ask what is an animal. In history, you assume there's history, but you don't ask what is history. If you do ask, you just give a cursory definition. You don't spend the whole, if it's a whole book on what is history, then that's not history book. It's a philosophy of history book. If it's a whole book on what is life, it's not a biology book, it's a philosophy of life book. So what Plato is saying here is that on this third level of the divided line, the subject matter is the arts and sciences. And the ideal ruler needs to be educated in the arts and sciences. They need a liberal arts education. They need to study history. They need to study all the humanities, literature, history, philosophy, theology, and study. Well, let's bracket philosophy for a minute. Everything, the third level doesn't include philosophy. So it means a liberal arts education, like Walsh claims to be liberal arts education, where there's emphasis on the humanities and the sciences, okay? The professions too, but if you look at this model of education that Plato's developing, it's not a model of education. It's not a business school that they have to go to be rulers. I mean, it's good to know about business and everything, but as long as there's a solid background in history, literature, theology, and so on. So this is this subject matter of the arts and sciences. It's the third level. Now, here's where it becomes interesting. Most people stop their education there. And what Plato is saying here is that the rulers now need to take it one more step, the big step. It's an important step. And that's the step into philosophy. They need to be able to know with certainty, to act rightly, and to speak with dignity. Okay, so they need three kinds of wisdoms: speculative wisdom, practical wisdom, and wisdom speaking. So philosophy, which includes practical wisdom and speculative wisdom, and classical rhetoric. Not the rhetoric of the sophists, though, the true art of rhetoric. In order to know fully, to understand situations fully, in order to act rightly, because they're making choices that are going to affect people. You all realize how important that is now, especially in this crisis we're moving through, the pandemic. how important decisions are and leadership is. And then the third level is to speak with dignity. When we speak, to speak the whole subject matter and to speak the truth, like Socrates was saying, to speak the whole truth. The whole plays a part in all three wisdoms. Speculative wisdom has to do with the whole story of existence, divine and human. I got that expression from a dialogue Plato wrote called the Phaedrus, where Phaedrus is asking Socrates, what is the subject matter of philosophy, Socrates? He says, the subject matter of philosophy is the whole story of existence, divine and human. So it's the ability to see how all this knowledge from the third level is connected together. It's the whole. The whole is the flower of wisdom, Pico once said. And then practical wisdom means being able to assess the whole situation. It's a different kind of whole. Now we're talking about the whole situation, seeing where this is coming from, where it's going, where it is, where it's going, knowledge of the past, historical precedent cases from the past, and moving into the future. So to be able to assess the whole situation and then to choose the best course of action that will lead to well-being for the community. That's practical wisdom. Phronesis in Greek. Sophia is speculative wisdom. Practical wisdom is acting rightly. And ethics plays a big part in that. And then wisdom speaking, alethine rhetoricae, true rhetoric. It has to do with bespeaking the whole situation, being able to articulate those other two wisdoms in language, to speak with dignity. So to know fully, to understand fully, that's speculative wisdom. To act rightly, that's practical wisdom. And to speak with dignity, that's called wisdom speaking. Now, how does one attain these three wisdoms? These are very important for the ruler. And the second wisdom is connected with arte, moral excellence, because you can't act rightly unless your character leads you to act for the common good and not just for your own self or for your constituencies. See, the greatest threat to a republic is sectarian interest. When one group dominates the well-being, where laws and everything is being bent towards a segment of the population instead of the whole. Republican political theory is that way, all the way from Plato all the way to the founding fathers of our country. There's emphasis on the common good. Okay, so this fourth level now takes those assumptions that are not questioned by the arts and sciences and questions precisely those. Now, the power that reveals that is noesis, Noesis. That's different than dianoia. Dianoia is mind, noesis is intellect, intellectual intuition. Plato uses the word intuition, but it's not intuition the way we think about it today. It's seeing with your mind's eye the essence of something. So like I used example from biology, seeing the essence of life. You get that by studying philosophy, not biology. Well, actually, you get it from both, combining the two. See, as you move up the divided line, you don't forget what you learned before. It's connected. So the arts and sciences are the third level, which is revealed through dianoia. But then when you get to the fourth level, you're seeing how that knowledge is connected to the principles upon which the knowledge is based. See, most people don't take that step in their education. This is what, so Plato wants them, the rulers, to be philosophers. They're educated and they have a knowledge of the arts and sciences, a solid grounding in the liberal arts. But that next step is to question the foundations upon which the arts and sciences are based. So in biology, you're asking, what is life? Anthropology, what does it mean to be human? With zoology, what is an animal? With history, what is history? We touched on that when I talked about Vico, who's the father of the philosophy of history. With politics or political science, then political philosophy. reading Plato's Republic, as we're doing, or Machiavelli's discourses and so on, the Prince. Okay, so now we're moving to the fourth level of the divided line. And the method that Plato advocates is dialectic. What he heard Socrates doing in the Agora, asking, well, what is life? What is a human? What is piety? What is justice? And so on. Asking these ultimate questions. But what they're searching for is the eidos, the idea, the ousia, the essence. Eidos is the Greek word for idea, and ousia is the word for essence in Greek. So they're looking for these ultimate ideas. Now I use the capital I, or forms. They usually use the word forms. For some reason, I don't know, the word form doesn't appeal to me as much as ideas. It depends. The Greek word is eidos. E-I-D-O-S is the singular. E-I-D-E is the plural. And I use a capital I or a capital F. If I use the word forms, I just make a uppercase F or uppercase I. And if I'm using the word idea, usually I use the word ideas. So these are the ultimate ideas. And through dialectic, then, one is shedding ignorance, like what we learned, like what Socrates was doing. Even in court, he was doing it. And you're shedding ignorance. And then one day will come where you have insight, immediate intellectual intuition into the essence of things. And one is transformed by that, because these are ultimate ideas. And now you have an insight into what is life. Once you have an insight into that, it changes you. This notion of transformation, it's in Plato, it's very strong. In fact, I need to talk about the Allegory of the Cave right now, but it's very strong in Plato, but I emphasize it because this course that I'm teaching, Philosophy Through Film, led me to that, because I wanted to teach Plato, and the Allegory of the Cave is nice to teach. I teach that, and then when you watch a movie, usually the characters change. And a lot of times they change because they have insight into something that they didn't have insight in before. So that's a very strong theme in Plato, but the secondary literature doesn't emphasize that. So I found my little niche there. It's in Plato, there's no doubt. I'm not making it up. It's just I emphasize it a lot. But it's very strong in the Allegory of the Cave. But I could make a claim. I mean, I could substantiate it. In philosophy, what we do is make arguments. So you just don't say things, like before you say something, you'd be able to back it up, right? And that backup, that's called premises. And when you make an argument, you make a claim, and then you support it with something. So how would I support this? Well, I would use the Allegory of the Cave, so many other places in Plato. When I was finished, it would be, no doubt, Plato was talking about how insight into the ideas, the ultimate ideas, transforms the person. I'm fascinated by that because there's certain things that when you learn something, you just know it and you didn't know it before. So I guess you're a different person because now you know something you didn't know before. Like now I know about photosynthesis, that I didn't know that before or something, or what a nerve cell looks like or something. But there are other ideas, and they're usually ultimate ideas, that when you gain insight into them, you're not the same person anymore. It's like you're transformed. And I heard someone say once, and it sort of stuck with me, if after your 4 years in college, you're not radically different person when you walk out, then you've wasted your money, they said. So there's some truth to that. So Plato thought that when you move to the fourth level through dialectic, and dialectic doesn't have to always be with other people too, it can be with your own self, but it's a lot easier with other people because, see, the other can think against you. And in order for thinking to move forward, it has to think against itself. So if you're just thinking alone and you're overly solitary, then you reach plateaus and you can't get with it. But have you ever noticed that? Then you talk with somebody and they can give you some insight and then it clarifies things. Or you reach an impasse and together, that it's not that they told you or you didn't say it. The dialogue itself had a sort of life of its own and illuminated. So Socrates always was looking for people, to talk with. But there's also images of Socrates just thinking. And thinking for Plato is an inner dialogue. It's always dialogue. So now we move to the fourth level, and it moves by way of dialectic. And the power of the mind is called dianoia, noesis. Dianoia is the third level. And what that reveals are the ultimate ideas with a capital I, or the forms, with a capital F. Now, what's that dot all about at the top of the line? Well, the dot is not touching the line. So the two bottom portions of the divided line have to do with the visible region, and it has to do with opinion. But as you move into the third level, now you move into the intelligible region and you move into knowledge. When you move to the fourth level, you're still in the intelligible region because these realities are intelligible, they're not material. You're going from physics to metaphysics, not physics the way we know it, but from the physical to the metaphysical, beyond the physical. And so those ideas are more real than the sensible particular. And the ultimate ideas are more real than the ideas with a lowercase I. So you have levels of reality. You have a copy at the bottom that's revealed by imagining. You have the sensible particular that's revealed by perception. And the sensible particular is a copy of what? Of the idea. So here's a copy of an elephant. That's the lowest level. Then second level, the elephant that you meet on the street in India. And then the elephant that you read about in your zoology class, on your, I guess not zoology, but what's the word when you study animals? Oh, there's a word. The idea of elephant. Or you can take like the moon, like any other, anything. It's what's the beauty of some of these philosophical ideas is that they can be generalized. So we're not just talking about elephants as circles. Okay, so when you move to the fourth level, these are the ultimate beings. Okay, and so these are the original, the ultimate ideas. And they're the condition for the possibility of the ideas on the third level. And the ideas on the third level are the condition for the possibility of the ideas of the sensible particular. And then the sensible particular is the condition for the possibility of the copy of the sensible. So you have a copy of a copy of a copy of the original. The original makes possible the copy of the original. The copy of the original makes possible the sensible particular. Sensible particular makes possible the copy of the sensible particular. So this is Plato's idealism. Now the dot represents the ultimate idea, which in the Republic he calls the idea of the good. Okay? And it's his knowledge, it's his notion of God. But Plato has this view of God that's not a being, but the source of all beings. So that's why the dot is not touching the line. Anything below the dot are beings, and they're ultimate beings. But these beings are all in the mind of God. Okay? And so instead of using the word God, because the word God has a reference to some being. And for Plato, God is not a being, but the source of all beings. So these ideas are in the mind of God. Okay? And he does say that only when I've reached that insight into the ultimate idea, the ultimate of ultimate ideas, the idea of the good, only then are you ready to become a true leader. And he even has this education all worked out. Let's see, what book is it? I think it's book 7, or is it the beginnings of, at the end of book 6? I'm not sure. About how long they would study this, how long to study that, how long to study this. Ultimately, I mean, I'm sure it doesn't have to be exactly down to the year, but the person is not ready to be a leader until they're 55. The last like 25 years studying philosophy. Okay, so, and then coming back down the line where you see everything in the lower parts of the line in the light of the higher parts of the line. That's important too. So that's called the divided line. Now that's the education of the philosopher rulers. And now what he does, and I'll try to be succinct, because I spent more time on the divided line than I wanted to, but just this will be my last talk on Plato. This is a survey class, so if we were doing just ancient philosophy or a course on Plato, then we would, you know, we would get into it in more depth. But so now what he does is moves into book 7, and that's in your collection. And Socrates tells Glaucon that everything we've been talking about now, all this talk about the divided line, you can use it to interpret what I'm going to tell you now. And then here comes the allegory of the cave. So this is the same ideas, only now expressed allegorically. And there's a lot more in the cave than there is. Now, Plato doesn't interpret this for us. He starts the interpretation, but he wants the reader to do it. Because Plato knows that if we interpret ourselves, then we make it our own. When you make something yourself, you make it your own. So, but you just can't say anything either. I mean, you're not just free to say anything. You know, there's a thin line between just free interpretation, saying whatever you want, and careful philology. When you interpret, what you want to do is use other parts of Plato's dialogues to shine light on that. Well, in this case, it's quite explicit. Take the divided line, use it as a master key to interpret the allegory of the cave. And then take all the subtleties of the imagery and interpret that and try to make it connect with other things that you've read in Plato. But this is, for many of you, this is your first real careful study of Plato. So it's a life project. I'm an old man now. I'm 69. I've been studying Plato since I was starting philosophy in 1973 or something like that. And, you know, I feel some maturity after all those years. But at the same time, you know, it's a lifelong project. It's not just something you get like overnight. But it's worth it. I mean, every great thinker's nourished themselves on Plato's dialogues. Everyone. So, okay. The allegory of the cave is, so Socrates tells Glaucon, and we're still talking about the education of the rulers, right? But he's talking about education for anyone. But because everyone's a ruler to a certain extent. I mean, if you're going to rule your own life, you have to lead yourself through life, right? So even if you're not a politician or anything, you have to lead yourself, right? But as soon as you move up in any organization, especially in politics or any organization, then more and more responsibilities are going to come on you. If you're a politician, then it's big. And if you're the president of the world power, then it's really big weight because your decisions are affecting millions of people. So Plato is talking about the education of the politician, but he's talking about any education. What is genuine education? What is education at when it reaches its highest level? It's called paideia. Well, he gives this allegory of the cave. So imagine this underground cave. And whenever I come to an allegory, what I do is just lay out all the elements of the allegory, the imagery, and then the action. In this case, the action is not much. This guy comes down in the cave, releases the other guy. That's it. So there's not much action. It's not a complicated plot or anything. But so then you can interpret the action, right? So there's imagery and action. Okay, so words and deeds, images and action. So, okay, first there's a cave. Imagine an underground cave. Now there are prisoners in the cave. So that's another image. The prisoners are there from birth or from a very early age. I've seen both in the text, but it doesn't really matter. That's one of the places where you can loosen up. Whether it doesn't matter if it's from birth or because the whole thing is a farce anyhow. You can't even live in a cave in ancient times for 10 minutes. There's no oxygen down there. So, I mean, the whole thing is a farce. But if you interpret that farce, it becomes more revealing than even history or science or anything because it's revealing universal truth. So it's not a replica of anything. It's not literally true. Plato knows that, right? It's an allegory. But if you can decipher the imagery, then it becomes quite revelatory. Okay, so the cave is one thing. The prisoners are another. The fact that they've been a prisoner from birth, that's important. Whether it's from birth or a very early age, it doesn't matter. The point is the same. What else? Well, there's a big fire burning behind the prisoners that they can't see because they're chained by their arms, their neck, and their legs. And they can only see the cave wall before them. Now, there's three things they can't see, Socrates says. They can't see themselves, they can't see their neighbor, and they can't see what's going on. Okay, so all this has to be interpreted. I'm deliberately not interpreting because I just want to put all the imagery out there, and then I'll go just systematically and interpret it for you. I'll give you my interpretation. Plato starts his own interpretation, and then he wants the reader to do it. Not haphazardly, not willy-nilly, but in a rigorous way, using other dialogues to shine light on the imagery, right? Especially the divided line I just talked about. Okay, so the prisoners, the cave, the big fire that's burning behind the prisoners, the fact that they can't see themselves, they can't see their neighbor, can't see what's going on. Now, there's a raised platform, and Socrates says, like the kind puppeteers use, which tells me there must have been puppet shows in ancient Greece. Like the kind puppeteers use, and it's raised, and it's in between the prisoners and the fire. And they're walking back and forth. They're still in the prison, but they're not chained, and they're talking. Now, the fire is casting light on these people walking, and it's making shadows. And so there are shadows on the cave wall. And this is what the prisoners can see. Now, since the prisoners can't turn around and see what's going on, they think those shadows are people. There's a big delusion going on. Let me be careful, because now I've already started to decipher. They think those shadows are real. And since these men who are walking back and forth are talking, their voices are echoing from the cave wall. So it looks like the shadows are talking. That's important. Let's see. And the other thing I think that might be important is the fact that they're divvying out like honor to the person who can best divine the pattern of the shadows. They're making a big deal about these shadows and the pattern, and whoever knows the pattern of these shadows gets honor for that. So there are other things, but that the shadows, the prisoners, the cave, the fire, the raised platform, the people walking back and forth, the fact they can't see themselves, the games they're playing, and then the shadow and the echoes. Those are the main things. All right, well, a man comes in the cave. Now, Plato just has some guy come in from the surface of the earth. And he liberates one of the prisoners. Doesn't liberate everyone. Now, that's important. And he makes a big deal about, Plato makes a big deal, or Socrates does. It's Socrates talking, but Plato wrote it, right? So I'm using the word Socrates and Plato interchangeably. So Socrates makes a big deal about how this prisoner who's been liberated resists. Big deal about that. He wants to go back to his comfort zone. He likes it there. It's almost like there's certain prisoners, real prisoners, they don't want to get out because all these decisions are made for them. But this is allegory, right? So we have to move into allegorical in reflection. They don't want to get out. And he puts up a big fight. This person doesn't give in though. He wrestles with him and he forces him out. And then slowly, this prisoner acquiesces and makes his way out. And then he gives up and makes his way. And then he starts seeing what's really going on. This is a fire, those are shadows, and these are people walking back and forth. These are echoes and so on and so forth. And they make their way up the long, steep upward climb. That's how Socrates says it. The long, steep upward climb. Overcoming resistance, getting to the surface of the earth. Now there's the cave wall, that's one level. There's the raised platform, these people carrying things back and forth. Level 2, it should remind you of something from the divided line. Now, the third level, the surface of the earth. There are trees and people and animals and things going on the surface of the earth. So you can imagine how that person would feel. You would think my whole life has been like a prisoner in an underground cave. He makes his way out of the cave, sees these things on the surface of the earth. And then he begins to see the luminaries of the sky, like the stars and the planets and the moon. And that's important too. We need to interpret that. And then he starts seeing the reflection of the sun in shiny surfaces like water and any shiny surface. And then he makes his way, he looks up and begins to try to look at the sun, but it's too bright. And he can only see the reflection of the sun in shiny surfaces and in water. The other thing that's important that I think is revealing in this allegory is the time it needs for the eyes to acclimate. If you go from darkness to light, and Plato knew this, the science was pretty developed at his time. They knew about the, not the retina, but the pupil. Your eyes dilate. So when you're in dark, your pupils get real big to let in more light. And then when you go in the light, it takes time for the pupils to dilate. As you get older, that whatever juice it is that makes them dilate, it dries up. Everything dries up when you get old. So it dries up. So that's why when I drive sometime at night and there's shiny lights, it's hard to see. When you're younger, it dilates faster. But the point is, when you go from darkness to light, it takes time for your eyes to acclimate. The word acclimate is perfect because your pupils have to like get smaller so you can see in the light. So this is important because at first you can see in the dark better than you can see in the light. But then after your eyes acclimate, then you can see in the light. It's just the opposite. Then when you go from light to darkness, you've done that before. Like if you go into a bar or something in the middle of the daytime and it's dark in there, and then your eyes, your pupils get smaller, and then you go outside and it's like bright, right? So what are you doing in a bar in the daylight? Okay, so Plato knows about this acclimating thing and he's playing with that, but it's going to have deep significance when we start interpreting. So now he sees the sun after some time. It takes a long time. Not just in shiny surfaces, but in its own space, in its own place. Maybe when it's setting or when rising, you can see it. When it's high noon, it's too bright. And he's filled with this beatific vision. Now, there's something I've been not emphasizing that needs to be emphasized. Plato thought that as you move up this divided line or move out of the cave, there's an emotional corresponding affect, feelings that correspond to that. It's not pleasure in the sense of like when I'm thirsty and I drink and then it's pleasurable, or I have an itch and I scratch it and it gives me pleasure. It's not a lack that's fulfilled. It's a different kind of joy, but there's an ecstasy or a feeling that corresponds to the insight into the higher levels of reality. So this is a beatific vision. This is going to be a big deal when we come to the Middle Ages. People like St. Augustine or Plotinus will take this from Plato and turn it all into, having a vision of God. And Plato has in mind God, but he's not using the word God. He uses the idea of the good. And I think deliberately to show that God is not a being, but the source of all beings. So this person with this beatific vision, this liberated prisoner, he wants to be the occasion for the liberation of his fellow prisoners. So he makes his way down again. Now his eyes have to acclimate the other way. When he gets to the cave, it's all dark. He can't see even as well as the cave dwellers. He can't even see the shadows very well. And he tries to liberate the prisoners. And now, again, Plato comes in very strong language. If they could get their hands free, they would kill the man that tries to set them free. Now, by the way, I mentioned this already. By the time Plato wrote any of his dialogues, especially the Republic, Socrates had already been executed. And he has Socrates in mind here because he goes on to say, Socrates says, the historical Socrates is already executed, but the Socrates in the dialogue says to Glaucon, and if they could get their hands free, they would kill the man who tries to set them free. Plato's talking about Socrates. And I know that more. I would substantiate that even more, because he says if he begins to talk about justice in courts of law among people who've only seen the shadows and copies of justice, there it is. I mean, it's clear as a bell. He has Socrates in mind, defending himself in court in the Apology. So there's the imagery, and these are the action. Now, what's it all mean? Here's my interpretation. I'll make it quick. I usually take my time on this. I've been teaching this for 40 years, I told you, and a lot of times I leave it up to the students, and sometimes I learn new things about that. But the best way is to read more of Plato's dialogues and use the rest of the Republic, and then the other dialogues shine light on this. But here's my interpretation. So, based on my knowledge of Plato, but also based on the context and Plato's own interpretation, where he has Socrates beginning to interpret. Here's how it starts, the interpretation. Glaucon says, what a strange image, Socrates, and strange prisoners. Yes, the word strange comes up because remember I told you philosophy sometimes looks at ordinary things in a strange way, and that's a good thing. I mean, I like this. I like when I see ordinary things in a strange way, because that means you're starting to reveal another way of seeing something that looks commonplace, but is quite extraordinary. I mean, the most extraordinary thing is being itself, right? And no one's hardly moved by that. I mean, even myself, who make a big deal about that in my lectures, I go about in my day, and only in glimpses do I realize how awesome it is that here we are. It's coming more and more as I get older and I get closer. I mean, I'll be 70 next year. That's old, but it comes more often now since I'm getting closer to the end. But it comes to philosophers. It's the awesomeness of existence, seeing things in a strange way. And then he says, strange indeed, but like us, and then he begins to interpret. But then the interpretation breaks off, and I think Plato wants us to interpret, but not just willy-nilly, and not just say anything, but in the light of Plato's philosophy. All right, so the cave represents the world, seen from the point of view of the multitudes, of all the people who are not living philosophically. Remember the contempt that Heraclitus felt towards the hoi polloi, toward the multitudes, or perhaps in Parmenides, the way of opinion and the way of truth. Remember the mortals, don't have access to the truth because they haven't moved into the divine level. So, Plato's not speaking in a vacuum. In fact, he knew pre-Socratic philosophy quite well. In the Timaeus, for sure, we didn't talk about Pythagoras too much, for example, but he got all this notion of harmony and the harmony of knowledge and so on from Pythagoras. But he takes elements of Parmenides, of Heraclitus. I'm going to leave that up to you. That's one of the questions I asked you to respond to. So that contempt toward the hoi polloi, not contempt, that's a little too strong, but maybe not, because in Heraclitus, there's really strong, I mean, remember he says in so many fragments about how the masses are asses in a sense, and it's strong in Parmenides too. He's not quite so ad hominem about the whole thing, but he doesn't call anyone names. Neither does Heraclitus. He's too regal for that. But he does have a strong critique of the ordinary way of being in the world, and so does Parmenides, and all the philosophers do. Sometimes when I think twice about whether or not I should have been a musician, because I love music and I'll never be a great musician, but I work at it hard. But, and I became a philosopher instead. And then I always come back to that at least I don't have to live in Plato's cave of delusion and bondage. So the cave represents the world seen from the point of view of the ordinary way of being in the world, the non-philosophical way of being in the world. The prisoners are the hoi polloi, the multitudes, the masses of people. The people who take peripheral things and make it central, and take central things and put it on the periphery, like what Socrates was saying. And why are they there from birth? Because they don't know any different, right? That's important, because see the cave is a cave of delusion and bondage. They're bound by their wrists, their arms. He makes it, I mean, this is a strong image of bondage, right? So they can't move. They can't see themselves, self-knowledge. Remember, know thyself with Thales? They can't see themselves. They can't see others. What does that mean? That means their relationships are external. They're business relationships. They're not deep, intimate relationships, heart-to-heart intimacy among people and friends. By the way, Plato has a really deep and rich notion of friendship. That's why we talk about platonic love. And usually people, all they know about that is, well, we're not having sex. It's friendship. But underneath that is this very rich and deep concept of friendship. We haven't gone into that. But there's a friendship going on between the person who releases one of the prisoners and the other prisoners. And they don't see what's going on. They lack circumspection. They lack that holistic vision that leaders need. And what about the shadows and the echoes? Well, this is the lowest level of the divided line. If you take the divided, now look at the divided line. It has 4 levels, right? Higher and higher levels. So the first level of the divided line corresponds to the shadows and the echoes coming from the cave wall. Second level, those people carrying things. Oh, I forgot to tell you, those men that are carrying, they're walking back and forth on that raised platform, they're carrying statues of man-made and natural things. Okay, so man-made and natural, that's the whole material world. They're carrying statuary. That's important. Like they're carrying things like that. They're carrying little statues of things. They can't carry an elephant, it's too, but they can carry a statue of an elephant, or can't carry a man, but they carry little dolls of it. So that's a weird thing, but I think I understand why he put that there. So the prisoners are the multitudes, the echoes, that's the hearsay that people believe in without going to the source. The shadows are the copies of the material world. Those people that are carrying things back and forth, those are the opinion makers, the politicians of Plato's day, and maybe a lot of the politicians of our day. They're opinion makers, and people follow them, but they don't really, the opinion makers are, their voices are echoing off the cave wall. And so people are listening to the echoes and they're not listening to the source. It's like listening to propaganda, listening to only one kind of news without going to the source. There's a movie that I was thinking of using always with this. It's called well, there's so many movies, but this one is, oh, it's not coming to me now. The Matrix. The Matrix, apparently there's a trilogy. I saw the first one and I wasn't real impressed, but I wasn't in the best mood for the movie. Maybe I should watch it again. But The Matrix is all about living in this virtual world. So, you know, there's no cave or anything. All this is allegorical. So it's a particular mindset that he's talking about. So one can make a big deal about the shadows and the echoes. Sometimes when I'm teaching, I'll spend a long time on this because about the echoes, about what is an echo. An echo is a weird thing, right? You say hello and it looks like it's coming from over there, but it's really coming from another place. It's a displacement of the source of something. So that reminds me of what, like when people talk, how do you know if what they say is true or not unless you go to the source? So they might be just passing the word along. So especially today when there's so much propaganda going on from both sides, it's very important to develop your critical thinking so you can make sound judgments about what is true and what is not. Like what is a conspiracy theory that has no basis in reality? And then there are real conspiracies too. So how do you know the difference between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory that has no basis in reality? Well, you have to go to the source and check it out, and then develop your critical thinking, and then you make your way to the truth, right? Otherwise, we're being duped all over the place. You're in the cave of delusion, listening to propaganda and thinking that's the news. So all this has relevance, especially for our time. I can't think of it. I've been teaching this for 40 years. I can't think of a time when this is more relevant than today. Okay, so what about this guy that comes in the cave, releases the other one? Well, this is the genuine educator, the teacher. And the teacher is not just imparting knowledge into this person, but he's liberating this person and showing him reality. And they make their way up the long, steep upward climb. That's paideia, that's education. It's a transformation of the self towards wisdom. And those things, and then the fact that it takes time for the eyes to acclimate, that means it doesn't happen overnight. It's a lifelong project. I remember my motive for finally finishing my dissertation after 12 years of college was so that I could begin to educate myself. I wanted to start my education without anyone else telling me anything. I just wanted to educate myself in my own way and be my own teacher. And so I finished my dissertation. So, but notice my motive for finishing my education was to start my education. So it doesn't happen overnight. That's the point. Okay, so the things on the surface of the earth, those are the ideas. That's the subject matter of the arts and sciences. The trees, the animals, the people, all the things he sees on the surface of the earth, those are the ideas, the subject matter of the arts and sciences. And when he looks up to the sky, the moon and the stars and the planets, those represent the ultimate ideas, okay? The sky. That's why, like, if you notice the colors of the gowns during the Middle Ages, like when we dress in our regalia, the philosophy has blue. Well, what else is blue? The sky. So yeah, we point upward toward the heavens, right? We don't point down to the heavens. So the ideas, intellect, the ultimate ideas, those are the luminaries. And what about the reflection of the sun in shiny surfaces? This is the reflection of the idea of the good in the hearts and minds and deeds of good people. Like how Plato saw in Socrates all the ideas of virtue, of arete, like wisdom and courage and justice, temperance and piety and so on. You're seeing the idea of the good reflected in the souls of people or in nature. And then what about this going back down? This is interesting. It sounds a little Christian, but this is before Christianity. But he wants to go back down into the cave and risk everything to become the occasion for the liberation of others. He'd be fine outside the cave. He's outside the cave, he's free. But he goes back down and he makes good trouble, as they say. And he risks everything to liberate his friends. Not everybody. Those people have a predilection towards. So it's a very strong image of delusion and bondage. So education has to do with becoming free. But this is not just political freedom. It's not self-rule. That's another thing. That's the freedom that comes with democratic republics. Self-rule. Plato's developing an aristocratic commonwealth. It's a different kind of freedom. It's the freedom to take all the principles upon which the arts and sciences are based, raise it to consciousness and making judgments about that and gaining insight into the ideas, these ultimate ideas. Let's see if I'm trying to think if I've left anything important out, but this is the education of the rulers for Plato, of leaders, political leaders, and of anybody who wants to lead anyone, even if you're going to lead yourself through life. This is the beginnings of the philosophy of education, but he's talking about the education of the philosopher rulers. Trying to think if I left anything that's important out. I've been teaching this for so long. So read the text, and the way what you want to do is pay attention to subtleties and use those subtleties to, like, for example, the one that's, it's not quite so subtle, but okay, so Plato has, I mean, you could pretend like Plato is living and you're asking him, Plato, why did you have, like, ask Plato questions. You know, I know it sounds weird, but like if Plato were here and you ask him, why did you have those prisoners be in the cave from birth? Why did you say that? You could have had them just be there for a little while. They're there from birth or from a very early age. And then you'll find your way to the answer. Well, Plato would say what? Because I wanted to illustrate the idea that they don't know the difference. They don't know any of the reality. They think the shadows are real. It's not just delusion, but it's the delusion of the delusion. It's a little bit like Carl Jung's notion of the shadow archetype. And maybe that's where he got it, actually. He read Plato, I'm sure. See, the shadow archetype I bet it is. I didn't think about that until now. For Carl Jung, the great psychologist, Carl Jung, who definitely read Plato, there's no doubt about it. And especially the Allegory of the Cave, I'm sure he read that. There's one of the archetypes that belongs to the collective unconscious of humans is called the shadow. And the shadow is all those sides of your nature that you don't see. But other people can see it sometimes, but you don't see it yourself. So what the prisoners don't see is that they think the shadows are real. And they think echoes are the shadows talking. They don't see that they're prisoners. The prisoners don't see that they're prisoners. That's the big delusion. Because if they could know they were prisoners, then they could take the steps to be get rid of their shackles. And by the way, there are no shackles, you know. The door's open. It's just you have to walk through it. So the whole thing is an allegory. As soon as you know you're a prisoner, you're free. See, when you're a real prisoner, you could know you're a prisoner, you're not going to get free unless you have a good lawyer and you know what you're doing. But in this case, since it's an allegory, as soon as you find out you're a prisoner, you're free. Because awareness is liberation here. We're talking about things of the mind. But this is the problem. People don't know they're prisoners. And this is probably the way it was that way in ancient Greece. It's that way today. It's really that way today, more than I've ever seen. But it's always going to be that way. So what Plato is saying, try to become one of those persons that make your way out of the cave of delusion and bondage. So what I've asked you to do for your writing, I've touched upon here and there in all these lectures I've given, but I haven't spoken explicitly. I did a little bit today with Parmenides and Thales, but I'm going to leave that up to you. And don't be uptight about your writing. Just write a couple pages on each of those 3 questions I gave you and do your best. Try to be articulate, though. You don't have to make essays. I mean, you don't have to make like a beginning, a middle, and an end, or introductory paragraph, whatever. But try to compose a nice 2.5 pages for each of those 3 questions. And I'm going to ask you, whatever you do say, to substantiate what you say on the basis of the text or my lectures. But use the text, and you use my lectures just to illuminate the text. Don't quote me or anything, because unless you quote that paper that was published that I read to you on Heraclitus, and you can quote that. But as far as my lectures go, just use those as to help you understand the text. So whatever point you make, all your key points, then put a little quote there from the text. You don't have to put the page number or anything, but quote it and then interpret the quote. And interpret it and say what it means, and then show how that supports your point. You know, it's sort of like law. You know, I've been watching on television a lot of these series, and a lot of them deal with law. The way lawyers move, they create a case. You know, trial lawyers, they make a case. So it's the same thing when you're making in scholarly things. You make a claim, and then you have to support your claim with a case, with some evidence. And then you try to do it in a persuasive way. But persuasion can't be the main point. It has to be, and that's why sometimes law gets unethical because of this. But with philosophy, you're making a case, but truth and what is right have to be at the forefront, not just getting somebody off, because you want to be a good lawyer. Okay, so that's my talk on the divided line, Allegory of the Cave. That's the end of book 6, beginning of book 7. And we'll move from there to Aristotle. Thanks.